So I'm Juliet Harris, I'm Director of Together, the Scottish Alliance for Children's Rights, and I'm here to talk to you about why educational inclusion is a human rights issue. So I will be speaking about what the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child says about educational inclusion, what's the situation in Scotland now, and what more needs to be done to ensure educational inclusion for all children in Scotland. So starting off with why educational inclusion is a human rights issue, I think it's important to reflect that children's rights are human rights. And human rights are the basic rights and freedoms that belong to everybody in the world, and this is from the moment that we're born. And they apply to everyone, regardless of where we're from, what we believe in, how we choose to live our life, then they cannot be taken away. Human rights are based on the values of dignity, honesty, fairness, respect and independence, and these values need to be at the heart of educational inclusion. It's important to reflect that they're not just abstract ideas. These are rights that are defined and protected in international law. So it's clear that educational inclusion is a human rights issue, and it is defined as well through the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Most people know that children have the right to education. However, inclusive education is more than just about the right to education. Inclusive education is when you bring together the child's right to education with their right to a quality education, which is also defined in the UNCRC, and the right to be respected within education, which is defined through the general principles of the UNCRC. So the right to education is in Article 28 of the UNCRC. And it's important to note this isn't just about provision of schools, it's about making schools accessible to all children. And it also includes areas around school discipline and making sure that school discipline is administered in a way that is consistent with a child's human dignity. And that's a really important point, that it's around human dignity. The right to equality of education is defined in Article 29 of the UNCRC in the aims of education. And again, the UN Committee go into a lot of detail here about how education needs to be about developing a child's personality, their talents, preparing them for adult life, ensuring that they understand respect for basic human rights, and developing their cultural and national values. The right to be respected within education is defined, as I said, within the general principles of the UNCRC. So this is around non-discrimination, around the best interests of the child, survival and development, and also perhaps the most well-known, which is Article 12 of the UNCRC, which is around the child's opinion. And it's important, again, to reflect on this because it's clear that it's not just about ensuring that a child has a voice, it's about listening to that child's voice and valuing their opinions. So the UN Committee themselves have made a number of comments on educational inclusion as a human rights issue. General comment number 1 on the aims of education is very clear about the effects of discrimination on children's ability to realise their right to educational inclusion, and that discrimination is capable of undermining and even destroying the capacity of a child to benefit from educational opportunities. So we need to think about the discrimination that children and young people might face, not just within school, but outside the school gates. And the fact that when they arrive at school, they bring their experiences of their family and of their community life, both positive and negative, and this will impact on them throughout the day. General comment number 9 on the rights of children with disabilities goes into more detail about defining what inclusive education is. And it talks about inclusive education being a set of values, principles and practices that does justice to the diversity of the learning conditions and requirements, not only of children with disabilities, but of all students. And again, this is an important comment because it shows us the importance of working with children as individuals in a way that respects their diversity and their learning needs. And so inclusive education results from a combination of values, principles and practices. And it's the combination of legislative policy and everyday practice that combine to form an inclusive education. So where are we now with inclusive education in Scotland? Looking at Together's 2016 State of Children's Rights report, we can see that there's been a general improvement in educational attainment from 2010 to 2015 among most children and young people. However, particularly vulnerable children are still facing increasing challenges that affect their right to education and to equality of education. And this includes young carers, minority ethnic children, children living in poverty. So, for example, challenges in achieving educational inclusion in Scotland mean that the achievement gap between the poorest 20% and the wealthiest 20% of pupils has widened sharply in 2015. Children with disabilities and additional support needs are increasingly disproportionately subjected to informal exclusions. 14% of care experienced young people leave school with no qualifications at all, in comparison to just 2% of all school leavers. So there are real challenges in achieving educational inclusion in Scotland, and we need to reflect on what action is being taken. To address these challenges, the Scottish Government stated that it wants to underpin its approach to educational reform with excellence and equality. And this is going to include extending funding available through the Scottish Attainment Challenge, reviewing the guidance available to education authorities on the mainstreaming duty. And it's certainly a positive beginning. They are doing things, but it's worth reflecting again on what the international human rights system has to say about our approach. For example, there are UNESCO guidelines for inclusion, and in these guidelines they talk about educational inclusion needing a clear philosophy. They talk about the need to define a set of inclusive principles together with practical ideas that guide the transition towards educational inclusion. And again, they point to the need to use the human rights system to underpin this approach. So looking back again at children's right to an inclusive education, inclusive principles are recognising human rights to access education, to equality of education, and to respect in education. And there are a number of practical steps that we can take to make this a reality. So in terms of access to education, this is about ensuring that children get the support that they need at school, and that it's an environment where everybody is able to learn. For the quality of education, going back to the principles of the UNCRC, this is making sure that education develops a child's personality and talents. It's in an environment where there is respect for the views of the child, for their values and for those of others. In terms of respect in education, this is about making sure that children's achievements are recognised, and recognising they're not just academic achievements. There are many, many achievements that children make in school that need to be acknowledged and recognised. They need time to talk, to have their voice heard. Everybody needs to be friendly. They need to be in an environment that feels welcoming and feels safe. So if we're going to achieve educational inclusion, we need to speak to children, and we need to listen to children about what they feel makes an inclusive education. How do children like to learn? What's the best way that teachers help them to learn? And what environment do children like to learn in? When do they feel respected? When do they feel listened to? Only by listening to children will their right to an education, their right to a quality education, and their right to be respected within education be achieved. And by bringing together these three key principles, these three key elements, then their human right to an inclusive education will be realised.